Hi, welcome to the Lead by Design show. I'm your host, Dev Singh. I have a question for you. What does it mean to lead by design? Exploring that question is the basic premise of this show, where I speak with inspiring leaders about leadership, design, agility, innovation, and many other things in between. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did, and I hope that in some way it inspires you to be a more mindful and conscious leader in your own life. Hi everybody, welcome to Lead by Design. I'm really excited to have my good friend and a bit of a kindred spirit, Brendan Marsh, on the show today. A lot of you will be excited to hear Brendan's background, so I'm going to get right into it and read his bio. And then I'll tell you a little bit about why I'm really excited to have Brendan on the show. Brendan has worked in the tech product space for 12 years and has recently returned to Australia after 6 years in Sweden. 5 of those he spent with Spotify during their hyper-growth phase, first as an Agile Coach, and then as a product manager for Spotify's desktop client. Brendan has an eclectic mix of skills and experience, having worked as an Agile/org coach, product manager, and chief product officer. He's worked on mature platforms with millions of users, blue sky innovation features, as well as in the depths of technical infrastructure with native client architecture and big data. Some big words there. We'll cover some of them in the conversation. For those of you who know me, you'll know that I connect and resonate with a lot of those things. But some of the topics of interest, I guess, are product management, product ownership, agile and lean coaching, product discovery, innovation, organizational design and culture, leadership coaching. And Brendan's particularly passionate about helping individuals, teams, and organizations to accomplish their goals through working with and acknowledging the human side of work. Throughout his time at Spotify, Brendan had the honor of giving talks across Europe about product discovery and the Agile Coach role, telling stories through the lens of Spotify's culture. Just prior to joining Organa, where Brendan currently works, Brendan worked at a nonprofit mental health startup on a mission to bring personal growth to the masses, and he joined Organa to bring lessons learned from Sweden to Australia, as well as wanting to be part of a company that shares the principles and ways of working he's come to love and admire, as have I. And I've come to really love and admire Brendan. I'm very grateful to have you as a friend, Brendan, and I'm really grateful to have you here on Lead by Design and finally getting a chance to talk to you on the show. I mean,
Dev, that was so nice. I feel really honored to be the second person that you have. Well, I don't know if you've had other recordings that you haven't published yet, but yeah, to be early on in this process and the only podcast I've listened to from yours that you've released so far being someone that was chief of design. So kind of being juxtaposed alongside such a legend in the industry as well as it's very nice. It's very humbling. Thank you, Dev.
Well, to be fair, you're the third person I'm recording with, and will probably be the third episode released. But also, you were the second person actually on my list of desired guests. The first person was Dr. Ann Stenros in the previous episode, who I interviewed. And you were the first person that I wanted to have this kind of conversation with for a really long time. As you know, you and I have talked about it casually as well, potentially even kicking up a podcast together and just exploring our conversations. And as you know, the reason is because I don't think we've had a single conversation that has gone to the time that we've allocated, because we both like booking in our conversations. But yeah, we can talk for hours. It's pretty evident by now that and it's so enjoyable. I probably don't get to tell you that in casual interactions, but I love going down rabbit holes with you, man. It's a real pleasure. So hopefully we can find some of those opportunities today.
The feeling is very mutual, Dev. And I love the way you described it as we never go to our allocated time. It's very true. For good reason. I mean, it's not often you meet someone that, I think you summed it up well with kindred spirits, for sure.
Awesome. So, man, I've got a bunch of questions for you. And some of them may be short and some of them may be longer. But I like to start these conversations with a bit of a left of field question, hopefully a question that you don't get asked too often. So the question is, in your bio, you refer to Spotify a lot. I know that you're quite proud of your time working in Spotify. You're literally wearing a Spotify hoodie. It's probably not very clear in the video. You could lift it up a little bit if you want to show people watching this on YouTube.
It actually says "Crikey, mate" on it.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I don't think you can see, but it's a hoodie I got from an Agile unconference that we held at the company when I was working as an Agile coach. Mm-hmm. And it was the second hoodie that I owned. The first one just had Brendan written on it. And the thought of having another one that also has Brendan on it, I thought, well, I've got to get creative this time. And at the time, there's not a lot of Aussies in Sweden. So at the time, my friends were making fun of the Australian accent and way of talking. So they were often saying, "Oh, crikey, mate." And so I thought it would be kind of fun to put "crikey, mate" on the hoodie. And it's stuck around with me for this long. It's quite comfortable. It's a bit ragged at the moment, but yeah. And yeah,
fair income.
Certainly. Yeah, fair income, mate.
Good on you. All right. So my question is, you have been very, you're clearly a proud champion of being ex Spotify, and I know it's one of those things that opens a lot of doors for you. I've heard the stereotype of Harvard people talking about being Harvard alumni and McKinsey people, ex-McKinsey people literally put that on their business card. Is there a shadow side associated with carrying that ex-Spotify label?
So I suppose shadow can mean a few different things, but from what I've learned in the psychology world, it's that part of you that you are potentially ashamed of, that you may not confront as often. So I suppose I'll take it from that perspective.
Sure.
I suppose seeing so many companies adopt the quote unquote Spotify model has been rather frustrating to see out in the industry, because it was never intended to be a model that one adopts. And even how it was written about in the beginning was supposed to be a snapshot in time of a mix of reality and aspiration. And I vaguely remember Henrik writing something along the lines of, by the time you read this, things will probably have been changed. And yet, speaking of McKinsey, as far as I know, some rather large consulting companies have managed to package up some of the vernacular that we used to talk about our organizational constructs and sell it to other companies as a kind of, this will solve all your problems thing.
Any particular examples come to mind?
Oh, McKinsey, as far as I know.
In terms of those vernacular that they packaged up.
Oh, right. Tribes, guilds, chapters, squads. The amount of companies in Australia I hear talk about squads is fascinating.
Yep, I've noticed that. I've noticed in McKinsey's thought leadership papers as well. Yeah. Sorry,
when I think about no, it's fine. When I think about the word squad, to me it was just an easy way of saying cross-functional product team. It's just simpler and easier to say that. What's unfortunate though is that some of the words have a lot more of a deeper meaning than anyone gives them credit for. So especially the concept of tribes. Concept of a tribe was really meant to imply that that we want to have a sense of belonging, because it's a scaling construct of multiple squads, and was meant to be the incubator and support structure for squads to exist. And when you think about a tribe, you don't think of a massive monolithic organization of thousands of people. You think probably like 50 to 100 people. And the concept of a tribe was built off the Dunbar number idea that, people can only create so many social connections. And it was even designed that way to be hopefully no more than about 150 people. And for the most part, I think it more or less stayed that way for the entirety that I was at the company. And if it ever, went larger than that, substructures were created to make sure that there was this sense of belonging and social cohesion. I think the shadow side at the moment is somewhat associated with, there was an article that went around from a product manager that worked at Spotify that basically says Spotify doesn't use the Spotify model and it didn't work, so you shouldn't either. And the more I've learned about psychology, the more and especially since leaving Spotify, the more I realized how much of my ego and sense of identity was attached to that brand, to the public persona that was created around it. And it's been a slow and somewhat painful journey, I would say, slowly starting to detach a little bit. But I'm still very proud of the culture and the environment that we had there at the time. And although I think some aspects of the culture went in a direction that I don't agree with, I still think it's a pretty awesome company, and I still have a lot of faith in the founders and the leadership of the company that they're doing the right things. I suppose that I don't want to be, on the one hand, I want to be able to lean on those experiences, and I see how great it is that it inspires people. And I think that's a good thing. I think there's a lot that can be learned from the mindset and the culture we had there. But I don't want to be the Spotify salesman. I don't want to become someone that sells the Spotify model, despite the fact that I have currently aspirations of replicating a course that's done in Europe that's all about the Spotify model. And this is an internal conflict that I have, because for me, the purpose of running that course, besides obviously like making money, is to put out a message to the people that are interested in Spotify's ways of working, to say all of it, so much of it was built on a foundation of think for yourself, solve your own problems, design your organization around the problems that you want to solve, which is so often lost when it comes to choosing a way of working. I mean, quite often you might go to a course and you learn about a particular way of working. So this would be perfect for our company. And then you go away, and many companies just implement the whole thing. And my colleague Daryl might have something to say about this, but SAFe is kind of a similar example, right? Where he would say that SAFe is a collection of practices that you could choose to adopt that help you to solve certain problems. However, it's also a machine that makes money and sells trainings. And
so can you give a bit of context to some of the audience is not going to know what SAFe is, Scaled Agile Framework.
Yeah.
Just explain what that is.
So SAFe is a collection of practices, ceremonies, structures, ways of working. If you think about Scrum being a framework that you can implement for a team to learn what it's like to be agile, SAFe takes that to the next level, where it says, here's a huge collection of ways of working and structures to help an entire enterprise learn what it's like to be agile. If you have that kind of glass half full mentality towards it, I suppose, if you have the right attitude towards it, it's a scaling, it's sort of an agile practices scaling methodology that hopefully you choose because you think that it will help solve and improve certain ways of working. And hopefully you start there, but you then evolve it to be something more fit for your purpose. And I think that's the problem with most frameworks and methodologies, is that people view it as the end state, not the beginning state. And it's kind of the same with the Spotify model, is that it's viewed as an end state rather than a beginning state.
Okay. So what about individually in terms of, so you referenced the notion of shadow as talked about by Carl Jung, for example, in psychology. What about in the way of, someone lives in someone else's shadow or in the shadow of something? It sounds to me like you have this desire of wanting to be more than just the ex-Spotify guy, where all of your value of your personal brand is vested in this one job that you had, or technically 3 jobs, and we'll come to that in a moment as well, that you had at Spotify, and or that period of time in your life where you were with this one really high-profile organization. Is there a burden to wearing that badge as your prime, so to speak?
I suppose it comes with it a certain level of imposter syndrome. So you're constantly asking yourself how much of what you learned through that experience was already there on a platter for you, and you kind of just worked in this amazing environment, and then when you leave, you're going to just fail anywhere else you go because you didn't have all of these great structures around you, versus they hired you because you had a relative amount of skill and experience already, and you were there to help improve what has already been improved to a certain amount, but can still be improved. So that imposter syndrome, I think, is something that I certainly carry with me.
Sure. Well, that's really interesting. Yeah. So the reason I asked you this, or the reason I wanted to ask you this question and talk about it, is you and I have had a lot of interesting career conversations, and I've got some really great career advice from you. And it's not because you're some sort of a professional career expert. It's because you've had a very interesting career, interesting transitions. You had this blessed opportunity as well. And I remember when I was going through a rough patch of thinking about my next moves, you helped me a lot in thinking about what do I want this to mean for my identity in the bigger picture, in the bigger scheme of things. I'm not sure if you remember those conversations much, or with the level of clarity I do. I remember because it had a big impact on me. Maybe you were just giving some casual advice to a friend, but it was really valuable. And I wonder about that sometimes, because I remember even at that point, I said something to you along the lines of, I really want a Spotify opportunity for myself. And since then, I've been reconciling that with this notion that I carry with me for quite some time, that actually I like being a big fish in a small pond and having a level of influence in a system that is not so mature, and the structures are not there to support you, because I feel I can have a bigger impact on it. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but it just made me think about those things, that once you have an experience like that, then is there a inevitable desire to free yourself from that label, or outgrow it and not feel trapped by it? Or is it just simply a blessing and it's like, no, I'm glad I can say I'm ex-Spotify and it's awesome. It opens a lot of doors for me, gets me a lot of opportunities, and that's great.
Yeah, the cold hard truth is that it kind of is that way. I mean, part of the justification for coming back to Australia was the notion that, in Stockholm, in Sweden, I hope they don't take this the wrong way, but, ex-Spotify Agile coaches are somewhat a dime a dozen. There's quite a lot of them. And people hire them because they put Spotify up on a pedestal. And I think Spotify has a lot of legitimacy to be on that pedestal. From being in there, my first impressions when joining the company was that it wasn't all hype. They're actually doing a lot of really good stuff. And so part of the justification for coming back to Australia was like, I can actually capitalize on that experience, because there's not a lot of people here that can say that they were a part of something like that. And I think we're all curious about, we're all curious when we meet people that worked in really fascinating, progressive, different styles of companies and what we can learn from them. And we had the same mindset at Spotify too. Like, I really wanted to go out and visit Valve because I was fascinated by their concept of having no managers, no structures. You can kind of work on what you want to. I'd read their employee handbook and I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I wonder what we can learn from that at Spotify. And so we always want to, I think like most people want to be inspired by people that were there, not just like researched it from the outside, but we're on the inside and can say, hey, like, yeah, we've talked about these things, especially, like Henrik Niebuhr's videos and so on. But there's always that curiosity. But how are things really? Like, where did you guys actually really struggle? We've heard all the good things, but, what was some of the tricky and challenging things? And when I used to do my talks around Europe, I would try and make it a habit to talk about the things that we weren't good at, because I think that was important to say, because it allowed people to feel like they're not some freaking unachievable mountain to which to climb. They're actually trying very hard to improve and solve their own problems. And you can do that too. Anyone can do that, as long as you're willing to, put the time, money, and discomfort needed to have the difficult conversations in order to get there. So to come back to your question, I view my time there as an opportunity that will eventually fade away. Spotify will eventually be seen as just another big tech company, I assume. We might even be there already, but occasionally catch myself saying we. I still feel very, attached to that wonderful green machine. Yeah, exactly. I don't know why I chose to wear it today out of all times, but it's still very positive. It's not something that I feel like I feel a strong urge to shake yet, because genuinely how I feel inside is that, it was this magical place where people were very valued, and I got to work with some amazing leaders that really put people first, and really kind of challenged some of the norms that are out there in the tech industry. Like, to be a leadership of a large organization, a large tech organization, you need to be very technically sound. And some of the best leaders I worked at Spotify were not. Some of the best managers and some of the best tribe leads, basically a divisional lead, were nowhere near as technical as some of the people that would report to them. And they did an amazing job. And that really shaped my views around leadership and management.
Okay, cool. So I want to get through some of these Spotify questions so we can move on to some other things. And hopefully some of these questions will be practical fodder for food for thought, but also some really tactical stuff as well for the audience. One thing I want to ask you, and you sort of actually started answering this already, in the context of all the public speaking that you've done and sharing of your wisdom that you've done, what do you get asked about the most? Which I think you maybe kind of answered. And what's something you wish you were asked more often?
Oh, it's actually a really hard question. I think what I get asked the most from those talks, obviously after the talks and during the Q&As, they're usually very specific. I think people love to know how theory is applied to practice. It's very easy to watch a lot of inspiring talks that talk about how something should be theoretically. What I like to do is talk about how things actually happen based on a fundamental principle or theory. So most of the time questions would be, well, how does Spotify handle situations like blah, or how do they do this, or how do they do that? And quite often the answer was, it depends. Because one of the things I quite liked about Spotify was that it had a very organic way of spreading structures, practices, roles, all that sort of stuff would very rarely come from top down. They would be discovered at the sort of bottom and then propagated because it made sense. An example of that was Sweden. The culture in Sweden is very consensus driven. Everyone sort of needs to agree on something before they go ahead and take an action. And one practice that myself and another colleague learned about at a course we felt that was helpful was consent-based decision making. And it's basically consent is the absence of objection. And we felt that this could be a useful tool to introduce to our tribes that each of us were working in. And so we introduced it and found it quite valuable because it meant that we could make decisions much faster. And if someone, while still being inclusive, so we get a lot of like very specific questions, how do chapter leads handle this? What happens when a tribe grows too big? Just all these like very specific questions. And I suppose that's how people try to understand a new way of doing things, is to really like stress test it or scenario test it. And then your other question was, what do I wish they would ask? I don't know if it's necessarily that I wish they would ask something in particular, but I quite often felt frustrated that the conversations aren't more around culture, mindset, leadership, behavior. To me, those things are so much more important than labels, practices. One of my favorite stories from Spotify was to see Daniel Ek, the CEO and founder, get up on stage time and time and time and time again and say, I want Spotify to make more mistakes than any other company in the world. And to me, as someone that really believed in the Agile Manifesto, really believed in the scientific method, to see a leadership of a very large company not only get up and say stuff like that, but also to then back it up with, and here's an example of where I messed up recently and what I learned from it. That's the kind of hard thing that, you can design all the org structures you want. You can create scrum teams and scrums of scrums and all this other stuff. But if you don't address the mindset problem, and especially at the leadership position, then you're always going to be conflicted between the environment you're trying to create and what leadership will allow to happen through their behavior and decision making. And so that's the kind of hairy topic. Or I suppose the other answer to that question is I wanted people to ask me more about what we were doing wrong, what we were struggling with. Because there's a lot of eyeballs on the kind of what we're doing right. But I love talking about the hard problems that we haven't figured out yet. And for many years, that was executing on large scale company initiatives. And we used to say quite openly that Spotify sucks at like big projects. So that like mainly because I wanted to encourage people to not see us as a all-knowing, all-powerful demigod company, but to see us as, just focusing on trying to solve problems. Fundamentally, you could even stop at the Agile Manifesto where it says we are trying to find new ways of doing things and helping others to do so. fundamentally, that's just a continuous improvement mentality. And that's at the heart of Spotify, all the way down to expectations placed on, say, software engineers, that you're constantly improving yourself and you're constantly trying to improve your team, the product, the company, everything. It's a continuous improvement mindset.
Well, regards to the first thing that you said, you wish that people would focus on. You're in the right place. This show is called Lead by Design, as you know, so we can talk about leadership and designing the right kind of mentalities and whatnot. And yeah, I agree. There's a lot of wisdom to be had learning from mistakes that you don't necessarily get from good judgment. What's that saying? Bad judgment leads to experience, and experience leads to good judgment. Good judgment usually just leads to some bravado, I find, not necessarily the wisdom that's found in the other direction. So I have a question for you to start leading towards this. And the question is, and this is a question from a dear friend and colleague of mine. I gave you a heads up about this before as well. The Spotify model has been of great influence for many in considering how they structure or rethink their own organizational design. From your experience, how does it, and I think by it, my friend is alluding to the Spotify model, how does it foster leadership by design, if indeed it does at all, and what can others learn from it? And it's a tricky question, because I also like to ask, and I'll sneak it in here to everyone on the show, what do you think it means to lead by design?
I suppose having guiding principles around how and why you do things, to me, is leading by design. I really like how the Agile Manifesto is written as trade-offs. Something is more important than something else. What I think made it great there was the acknowledgement that everything is a trade-off. So by leading with design, to me, you're designing trade-offs. You're designing, what do you value more than something else? And in creating the organizational design at Spotify originally, to me, my understanding of the context around that, it was, a company that is new, that's found product market fit, but that knows that these very other big companies like Apple, Google, Amazon are going to create competitive products. They have more money than Spotify has. They have more people. They have more lawyers, possibly more connections. If you say, for example, look at Apple and the connections in the music industry they had over the years with iTunes and so on. And so they can easily halve the cost of a premium subscription, for example, and create a Me Too product. So product is basically the same. How do we compete with that? Well, our product strategy that early on was we compete by having a better product, having more reasons for someone to use our product than theirs. How do you create innovation and product differentiation at scale? Well, it's certainly not from having, Daniel X sit in a room being the mastermind of all the new ideas that's going to come to the company. And he would talk about that often. It's like, the next big idea for the company is not going to come from me. You can read about it in Marty Kagan's book, Inspired, for example. It talks a lot about how software engineers are often one of your greatest sort of resources in coming up with better ideas for a product. And so the design itself was about how do you support and enable that to happen. It's not how do you force it to happen or even facilitate it to happen. It's how do you allow it. So that to me influences, and so I suppose if you look at innovation and product differentiation being the thing that we want, what are we giving up by choosing that? And I suppose what we're giving up is being able to do big cross-org initiatives well, because it requires a certain amount of autonomy out in the teams to enable that. It means hiring leaders that are more of a servant leadership mentality, having quite a lightweight way of providing alignment to the organization around what to do. It means separating line management from product direction. So in quite a lot of companies, your line manager basically dictates what it is that you do. So to me, leadership by design is about principles. It's about adherence to principles. And principles, to me, are about trade-offs. So that's kind of how I think about it. And being consistent. So not like reacting to the next thing that comes along and throwing all your principles out the window, and actually keeping with your principles even when it hurts. And I think one of the things I admired about Spotify was pretty good at that. A really good example of that was when there was a product launch and someone in the company, we didn't know who, had leaked to the press what we were up to. And our chief product officer, Gustav, was understandably quite furious about this. And I'll never forget him getting up on stage and saying, "This is really tough for us because we're really unhappy about this. And we want to find out who did this and basically fire them, right? Like, this is not okay." And fair enough. You know, you've basically betrayed the trust that you're given, and you're given so much trust at that company, so much. Like, any engineer could bring the whole company down through the amount of access they have to stuff, or anyone really. And I remember him getting up on stage and saying, "We're really at a fork in the road here. We could either not share as liberally with you what we're up to and what we're doing, in the hope that it will reduce situations like this. So reduce some of that trust. Or we can double down on it and say, look, this is unacceptable, but we still fundamentally believe that a high degree of trust in this organization will still enable great things to happen. If we're very freely, everything from financial, investor reporting, metrics about how the company's doing, good and bad, acquisitions that haven't happened yet, all that sort of stuff is fairly broadly available to pretty much everyone, even down to interns, which is pretty remarkable, I think. But staying in your belief and principle and being fairly consistent with that. So of course he said, we're going to stay trusting you. And we hope that that's the right decision. To me, was a really admirable thing. So
was that part of the Spotify model, would you say, or was it part of one leader's decision? Or because I'm very conscious of the fact that people talk a lot about the Spotify model, and it's funny enough, there's a follow-up question to the first question that I asked, which I think ties in very neatly to what we're talking about, which is, do you think it's possible to Spotify an existing bureaucratic and hierarchical institution, or is such a model only possible when you're building a greenfields organization from the ground up? And the thing I want to caveat to that question is, it sounds to me like what you're saying is the Spotify model, which people think of as the organizational design, the infrastructure, the even the agile architecture of how the hiring is done, all of that is actually secondary to the fundamental principles or trade-offs that were made in different circumstances, and the guiding principles to how you make those trade-offs.
Yeah.
Which is not really, that's not something you can articulate in a organizational design as such, is it? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can.
Yeah, I suppose we're getting down to semantics of what is and isn't a model But I
But I know,
the Spotify.
like when people talk about the Spotify model, I know, for example, that Henrik Nyberg video is very popular, talking about the Spotify model, and people do focus a lot on the tribes and the squads, as you mentioned earlier. So I don't mean to be too philosophical about the semantics. So let me just be clear. When I say people focus in on the Spotify model and they think of it as the organizational design, I mean literally they talk about how teams are set up, and that tends to be the chunk of it. Is the culture actually the outcome of that, or is the culture a correlation to that? I guess that's actually what I'm getting at. How much can you actually get out of? So when you talk about something like Spotifying a bureaucratic or hierarchical institution, what is that? What do you think that actually?
So if I think about Spotifying an existing bureaucratic organization, the connotations associated with that to me are fairly negative. It's like we've drunk the Kool-Aid and we're going to apply a bunch of terminology and constructs that we don't fully understand that's applicable to a company that's extremely different to us, and hope that that's the right thing to do. So I sort of don't really. I'm quite torn because I do think it is useful to take inspiration from another company to be inspired about solving a problem. And if they've solved the same problem as you have, then how they solved it might be quite beneficial to you. But to take the whole thing, to me, it's like, what's the chances? That's why we like to simplify the answer to this question a lot. We used to say, are you a hyper growth music streaming product tech company? And if the answer is no, then it's like, well, why are you doing this? And that sounds a bit obnoxious, but it's at the root of answering this question. It's like, well, think for yourself. The roots of I suppose Spotify was I don't know what the right word is, lucky or whatever, but they started out with Scrum teams and Scrum masters in the beginning, so they were never traditional, so they had that going for them. I don't know. I don't think it's wise to Spotify a bureaucratic company, frankly. I'm a big fan of starting. It's like the lean principle: start where you are now and commit to evolutionary change. Because if you know anything about, A/B testing, for example, if you run 10 A/B tests at the same time with 10 different hypotheses and hoping that, they're all going to result in something good, figuring out what made you good is going to be extremely difficult because of the, pollution of the data in some ways. So it's best to, test a hypothesis at a time and see if that was beneficial to do, so that you can potentially change it, roll back, whatever. But test, like trying to implement 100 different changes at the same time and think that that's going to solve a bunch of problems makes it extremely difficult to know which of those things you did was helpful and which was harmful. Because it's like the role of product manager. If you take a product manager of a startup and throw them into an enterprise, they're gonna have a hard time, and vice versa, because the local context is different, and the skill sets needed to succeed in each of those environments are different.
You started as an Agile coach in Spotify, and then you moved to be a product owner, and then you moved to be a product manager. I want to know why, and what was that experience like transitioning? And also, what was the difference, at least in the Spotify context, between being a product owner and then being a product manager? But particularly, I'm interested if you have to pick one of them, because I ask a few questions at once. I do that sometimes. Yeah, why did you decide to stop being an agile coach and start being a product owner? And what was that experience like?
So funnily enough, my entry into agile coaching in general came about from wanting to be better at building great products. So it originated from originally working at a very small startup that eventually failed and ran out of money. But the most amount of success we had was when we fundamentally pivoted to more agile ways of working. And so my desire to learn more about agile product thinking, all that sort of stuff came about from being in a product position and wanting to succeed with a product. So it's almost the inverse. And so after doing agile coaching for a little while, the itch to get back into product became stronger and stronger, because that's sort of originally where I started out. Although, where I started out was seeing product development as a very delivery focused endeavor, and eventually learning that that's not the case. Learning about discovery and, building the right thing, I suppose. But there's the why of getting back into product at the time, and then there's the why in terms of reflecting on it many years down the track. And I think the why at the time was a desire to be back in the driver's seat of a product. I felt that a lot of the product organization was very low on skills like empathy and an acknowledgement of the whole of the team as being an important factor in succeeding in building a product. And so I had this I had a subconscious desire to be a role model for product managers, where I was someone that, cared about the people in the team and saw their importance and potential in succeeding in the product. I think that was, and I suppose it was well known and even publicly acknowledged at some point that in Spotify, the product organization's weakness is on continuously growing their people and their practices. So they're very delivery results focused. But their strength was that. And then vice versa for the tech organization where I worked in as an agile coach. So very strong on mindset, culture, continuous improvement, being people focused, and so on, but seemingly weak at, delivery obligations, results, that sort of stuff. So I think I thought at the time, and I fundamentally failed at this, but I thought I could bring in some of that organizational voodoo, some of that warm and fuzzy, people-focused spirit from the tech organization into the product organization. And the reality was that the perception from the people that would be hiring me into the product organization was that was a concern, was that, I'm going to be more focused on that than I am on creating great results for product. And in some ways they were right to be concerned for that, because it's not my job to focus on those things. So it did make the entry into product very difficult for me. I got placed into a role, and then actually I almost got placed into a role, and then they changed their minds at the last minute, which was devastating for me at the time. And then I got placed into an interim PO role, which was interim for way too long, given how much I was being told I was doing a good job. So that was really painful. So it was not a smooth ride at all. And part of that just had to do with a lot of big organizational changes that were happening at the time and so on. But yeah, I had to learn a lot. I think before this recorded session, we were talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? And my understanding of being a product owner or product manager was very driven by what I'd learned from product ownership, the agile world, like iterating, feedback, all that sort of stuff. What I was severely missing was product strategy, stakeholder management, a lot of the things that you can't really associate with typical kind of agile product ownership practices. And so I had to learn a lot of that quite quickly because I was very weak at it.
Is that because it's a lack in agile product ownership, or is it because they're just two different jobs, product owner and product manager?
Yeah, so I suppose I can answer that question as well. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as product manager as a role at Spotify. Everyone was called a product owner. And a decision was made while I was a product owner to change the name of the role to product manager. So, and with that decision, so the decision was mainly, from my memory, two reasons. One is to try and attract more strategic thinking product managers to the company. So like when you try and hire product owners, the way that a lot of the industry sees that role as product owner is someone that focuses on tactical delivery and at best, maybe tactical discovery as well. But it's very tactical in nature. You know, you're only thinking a few sprints ahead. I'm generalizing, right? But and then product management is seen as a more strategic role where you are constantly updating a view of your product strategy based on a whole number of internal and external factors that they typically don't teach at a certified Scrum product owner training, for example. It's all about the backlog and Scrum and iterations and all that sort of thing. So at Spotify, the role is the same role, but the reason that they changed the name is they wanted to try and hire people that were going to do more product strategy and product management in general, really. And secondly, they wanted to reset expectations with the product organization to say, hey, what we're seeing is a lot of people focusing on delivery. And we're not thinking enough about the future, about strategy, about how what is going on out in the teams relates back to, say, the 2 to 5 year strategy for the business and where they want to get to and how your part of the product sits with that strategy. Not enough, stakeholder conversations, innovation. We really wanted to get people to think big and not just be in this little like baby step iteration of the product anymore. And that was a really necessary change, I think. And I needed to change in that way as well, because I think that I do believe that most organizations would benefit from having one product manager per team and not this sort of notion of like a product owner that focuses on delivery and a product manager that focuses on strategy, and the two somehow have to figure it out. Now, in saying that, when I became product manager for the desktop team, it was like 22 people or something. It was huge. And so I couldn't get involved in the tactical anymore because it was just there was too many people. It was too big. So we kind of worked in a way, at least for a while, where we had people kind of acting as product owners, and we split our team up into multiple sort of sub teams, which is pretty much the thing I'm saying that I don't agree with.
Is that one of the mistakes that you feel were you wish you would talk about more? Sorry, let me rephrase.
Yeah.
Is that one of the mistakes that you noticed at Spotify that you would like to talk about more generally, or you wish that people would ask about?
Yeah, I mean, mistake, challenge, problem. Yeah, pretty much. I would say so. But it was the nice part about it. I actually think it was still a good and the right decision at the time, because it brought together a whole bunch of people from across the business that didn't have the overall context of the product that they were working on, including myself. And so the unity that it created within the team, within that large team, and the kind of breadth of understanding of the product that we were working on was really beneficial, so that when we did split up the team, everyone had a lot more context around the overall understanding of the product, strategy, and all that sort of stuff. So I think it was a good idea, but I wouldn't have kept it that way. And at the time, I think I was okay with the idea of breaking up the team, I think, but it wasn't a popular idea amongst some. But I think it was a good decision.
Okay. I want to dig into this question a little bit more about your experience of the difference between working in that coach role and working in, let's just say, product management generally. So in your bio, it says that you're particularly passionate about helping individuals, teams, and organizations to accomplish their goals through working with and acknowledging the human side of work. I used to have a pretty strong bias that there were some roles that were better positioned to do that, and some roles that were not as well positioned to do that. Maybe roles that are pigeonholed into delivery or more weighted on strategy maybe are not as well positioned to help individuals, teams, and organizations accomplishing their goals through working with and acknowledging the human side of work. So I'm curious what your experience was in terms of being able to do those things, being able to help individuals, teams, and organizations through working with and acknowledging the human side of work in both of those roles, or generally speaking, working as a coach versus working as a product manager / leader. And before you answer that, what's the human side of work? What does that mean?
It's just the acknowledgement that all roads lead back to people when it comes to work. I mean, even robots are programmed by people. So an example of an anti-pattern towards that statement would just be when you go into an organization and they refer to people as resources. To me, that is the opposite of what I'm talking about. It's the acknowledgement that it's the acknowledgement of everything we've learned about psychology and motivational science and all this sort of stuff all over the years, that humans are complex beings and we are not as rational as what we think we are. even down to like when you're building a product for a customer, them saying they want something, what they want and what they need are quite often two different things. It's like the, build me a faster horse story, or the story of the iPod where someone would say, I want to be able to fit more CDs in my handbag. What's the problem you're solving there? Well, you want access to all your music. It's not that you want more CDs in your handbag. So acknowledging the humanness in work, that it's there and you can't ignore it. And it is a factor in everything that we do when it comes to work, whether it's down to cognitive bias, whether it's down to even people having really horrible things happening in their personal life and how that affects them at work. You can either choose to ignore that and make their life even worse by, just looking at the results that they're getting and say, well, why aren't you getting these results? Or you can acknowledge the reality that there's some stuff going on, and how you support someone through that might be the difference between them just burning out and leaving and creating toxicity around them based on how they've been treated and so on, versus someone feeling like, wow, this manager or company really cares about me And I really want to do my best work here because they've actually acknowledged me as a human being. So that's my, like, we were talking about earlier on how I'm a cross between a geek and a hippie. This is my like hippie soapbox stand that I will stand on.
I don't know if that's giving the human side of work a bad name or hippies a bad name, but let's not generalize so much. Yeah. Either one of those things.
And then your question was about how, how does that relate to both of those different roles? And
and do different roles, particularly across those two. Do those different roles enable or hold you back from being able to do that more or less?
I think they're just at different levels of importance and take up different amounts of space in your head. So, as an agile coach, I think it should take up a lot of space because ultimately you're kind of a gardener to a garden of plants, and those plants are the humans. And if you nurture them and you provide the right structures and support, and you can coach people and help them, then they will do amazing things. They will exceed your expectations of what you think they're capable of quite often. However, as a product manager, your problems to be solved are quite often less about that, or rather, it's secondary. So I think you still, for example, one of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed doing before Spotify was learning about user research and how to ask unbiased questions, for example. That fundamentally changed how I think about building products and my own assumptions. Reading the Lean Startup and reading stories about how they spent 3 months building a instant messaging integration and they thought it was supposed to be used in one way, but it turns out the customers didn't want it. And they only found that out by really checking their ego at the door and being prepared to be wrong. And so I would say, as a product manager, besides the kind of user research aspect to it, it's a lot more about managing yourself than it is about nurturing other people, I would say. Whereas the coach role is more about nurturing other people. And obviously to be a good role model for the mindset and principles, you have to do a lot of nurturing yourself. Whereas I think it's a little less active in the product management role because it is a lot about, results and strategy and metrics and all of these task related rather than people related factors.
It's really interesting. Lisa Adkins has this quote, Lisa Adkins being someone that you and I are both a fan of.
Very much so.
Yeah. So I had a few quotes written down that I thought would be helpful prompts to this conversation. And there's a quote that I had written down from her. We practice mastering ourselves in the moment so that we can better open ourselves to being a servant leader and to harness our emotions and choose what to do with our reactions. That's a quote from Lisa Adkins' book, Coaching Agile Teams. And I found it very universally applicable, very relevant. If somebody asked me as a product owner, product manager, or just any other role, to be honest, the importance of this, I'm noticing more and more and appreciating more and more how valuable it is just as a leader. And if you will, in this context, if you want to lead by design, you have to have some practice of mastering yourself in the moment as well. Just curious to find out if, in your experience of going from being a coach to a product owner and product manager and working in that product space where you are thinking a little bit more about strategy and delivery, do you feel you were taken away from those opportunities to practice mastering yourself as much in the moment because of the nature of those roles? Or did it become more important or less important?
My gut feeling is equally, if not even more important, because your mind is quite occupied with things that aren't people related, your job, to me, like as a product manager, your job is to understand, is to kind of wrap your head around a whole bunch of different external and internal signals, and to make sense of that complexity and then communicate it in a simple way. All with the understanding that you might be very wrong, right? And also noting that, some of the people in your team might be the ones to come up with the next massive idea that's going to blow your product out of the water. And unless you enable that to happen, which is about self-management, really, it's about not shooting down ideas. It's about asking the right questions. It's about creating slack and space for those ideas to blossom. Then you're just hindering potential in your team. And so I'd say it's fairly on par, perhaps, with the Agile Coach role, just in different ways, because you're going to get very motivated and excited about where your product's going, the ideas you have for it, stakeholders that are excited about it or have different views on you. There's so much going on. It's such a busy role. Like, it's any wonder that, Marty Kagan came up with the idea of being, I don't know, no, it wasn't him that came up with the idea, but he's talked about the idea about the mini CEO analogy of the product manager role. And so you like the context switching and the juggling that you're having to do so much on a regular basis is kind of the opposite of mindfulness, right? You're constantly managing neurons in your brain firing in so many different directions all the time. And so the need to self-manage is just as much there, I think. Otherwise, you can shoot down innovation. You can create loads of confusion. There's so much that can go wrong by not managing yourself as a product manager. And I suppose I've seen loads of examples, and including myself, where, if you don't keep yourself in check, you're doing your product and your team a disservice.
Yeah, and I can very confidently say that translates to any role that demands a lot of context switching and people leadership. And often it's strange how those things end up going hand in hand. As people escalate above with more responsibility for people, they also end up having more responsibility for context switching, or having to switch and manage between a lot of different contexts. That is also a very, very interesting topic. I feel we could go very deep into. We might have to make a whole series of this, Brendan, and do little masterclass type episodes on this. Very, very interesting perspective.
If it means we get to hang out and have fun conversations, Dev, I'm all for it.
Oh, totally, man. Definitely. Having said that, we are a little bit on time, so I'm gonna leave a bunch of other questions that I was really keen to ask you for next time. But I want to close on one question, and we can talk about this for as long as it takes. There's no rush, but let's have this as a little bit of a closing out question, because I want to make sure you get a chance to speak about the stuff that you expressed that you don't get to talk about too often. So in your bio, you said you joined Organa to bring lessons learned from Sweden to Australia. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the most valuable lessons you have brought from Sweden back to Australia? But maybe you can answer it in the context of, what are some of the most valuable lessons you've brought from Sweden back to Australia that you learned from observing mistakes, whether at Spotify or elsewhere, or making mistakes of your own?
So I think, I've got the perfect example. So when I joined Spotify, there's lots of different flavors of Agile coaches in terms of the kinds of tools and problems that they're good at solving. My background up until that point was learning about user research, learning to work with tools like Lean Model, Canvas. And so real like product related agile coaching stuff, I would say, like facilitating teams to make good product decisions. And so where do they put me in the organization? Right in the deep depths of data infrastructure, where all of this stuff around like, product metrics and user research and UX even all goes out the window. Like I'm working with teams that own series of, we used to call it like the plumbing of the company, rather than, the shiny features and all that sort of stuff. And so one of the teams that I got put with was an absolute disaster. I failed miserably. This team had other coaches that had tried to help them in the past. All of them had failed. And I came in with my toolbox. I've got some Scrum, I've got some Kanban, I've got these agile processes and tools and practices and methods. How can I apply them to this team to help them in the situation that they're in? And that mentality blew up massively in my face. This team had constantly had management intervention, and I would call coaches being part of that intervention, because they were perceived as not performing well. And I'm quite a positive, optimistic guy. One of the first mistakes I made was not spend enough time with one of the previous coaches. Shout out to Victor Cessan, in understanding what his attempts had been. I sort of came in and I thought, I'm going to come in with a fresh eye, right? I'm going to try not to let his experiences bias mine. Oh boy, was I wrong about that.
That's hilarious.
And
because we're all unique, special snowflakes.
Totally. And so the thing that I think I did that helped the most for that team, and it wasn't even my idea, so I can't even claim that, was to step away from them and let them fail. And that was extremely difficult because it was like an acknowledgement that I had failed. And not just like made a mistake, failed, and I could learn from it, but everything I'd done to try and help this team failed. So it was like not a particularly great kind of failure either. And what I learned from that experience was so fundamental to how I think most coaches at Spotify thought and acted, which is that process and methods and practices are only one small piece of the overall puzzle. It's getting to know each person in the team, how they think and feel about their team and their challenges, what their relationship with their manager is like, what their aspirations are, all of these people aspect of the full picture that is the team. I had not taken the time to wrap my head around that. I hadn't had the experience of walking away from a team and like letting them fail. I'd never done that before. So what I learned from that was that if you have a team that are struggling, if you have a team that know that something could be improved and want to improve, then all those tools and practices and everything are a great way at helping them improve, right? You come with your toolbox and they're like, hey, we're kind of drowning under all the weight of stuff that people are asking us to do. Okay, maybe like limiting work in progress could help here. Maybe breaking things down smaller, maybe saying no, whatever that might be, it can help. But if the team is fundamentally dysfunctional in how they are around each other and how they are towards leadership and people that provide them with direction and so on, then all those processes, tools, methods, practices potentially can just make things worse because you're actually focusing on the wrong problem. And I would sum it up when the opportunity I had to kind of express this was at a conference I spoke at in Iceland. It's a lean conference. And I was on a panel and someone spoke up and said, I'm having this issue where a member of this team is really resistant to these lean practices that I'm trying to introduce to the team. Do you have any advice for how I can convince them to use these practices and these ways of working? And seeing the opportunity to share what I'd learned through that experience, I was like, oh, please let me answer this one. And my answer was, what if the reason for them pushing back on these practices has absolutely nothing to do with the practices themselves? What if they have a terrible relationship with their manager where they feel like they're not being heard, for example, or they feel like the work they do doesn't get recognized? What if they're having a terrible time at home and that is whether consciously or subconsciously manifesting at work? Any number of things could be the reason why someone or someones are holding the team back from working well as a team and being high performing. So that experience really solidified this notion that, of being human focused, I suppose, because even the principles of Agile and the methods, all that stuff, they work well when you have people that feel aligned, confident. They get along with each other, generally speaking. But if the basics of team cohesion is not there, even if it's just one person which is deeply unhappy, it can bring everything else down. And so the lesson learned there is to start there, is to start by talking to the people that are trying to work and improve. Because sometimes people don't want to work and improve. Sometimes they're in a bad place, and that's okay. That's human. It happens to all of us. But starting there is a great way to make sure that you don't mess it all up by assuming that it's just a process problem, because process is just one piece of the puzzle. And I think what helped me being in that part of the organization in data infrastructure, having the manager that I had, which is the best manager I've ever had in the world, Ingrid Frank, if she ever gets to hear this, she still is by far the best, most inspiring person that I've ever worked with, because she gets it. She eventually became a tribe lead, and she was by far, I think, as far as I know, she was unless she hit it very well, but she was probably the least technical out of the tribe leads. But she, in my view, was one of, if not the best, because she saw her role as a servant leader to the organization to help the organization thrive, not to push ways of working, not to push certain directions. It was to really support. It was the true definition of servant leadership. And so the thing that if I was to sum up everything I learned from that experience, especially in such a progressive society like Sweden, where the attention they pay to helping people have the best shot at life as they can, which is quite a sort of a socialistic government way of being, I suppose. There's a lot of safety nets. Was this notion that, help people, support people to do their best work, and they will. And it's such a simple learning, but I had to learn it the hard way, which was to, have it all blow up in my face, step away from a team for a while, and let them figure it out. Let them realize, hey, we need some help with these things. Maybe we could ask one of those Agile Coach folks. And it paid off massively in one of the next teams I worked with, where there was, be careful how I talk about this. I worked in a team where I knew one of the guys in the team was a tough customer. He had some very critical views on lean and agile, especially if you brought up stuff like cycle time. He would just let you have it. Just be like, it's all crap. You can't compare work to one another. Every bit of work we do is different. So how could you possibly measure it, average it, and make predictions over it? Like he would just, if you brought up stuff like that, it would set a trigger off in his head and just, blah, right? And from the other coaches I'd spoken to, he was not a fan of coaches. And he even said it to me. He said, like, I think you're nice people. Because I think you're nice people, but I don't think you actually provide much value. It was really brutal, but he was also being honest. And he was like, I've worked with coaches before. I think they're nice people. I'm happy to go for a beer with them or whatever, but they're just, I don't think they really provide a lot of value. And
well, I've certainly worked with a lot of useless coaches, so I can appreciate that coaching is very invaluable, and there are plenty of rather useless coaches. That tends to be my my perspective on that. But we are nice people, so go ahead.
We have, most of us have good intentions, right? I think most humans do. So the product owner of this team really wanted me to facilitate a kickoff where we would do a bunch of like team building exercises, and even choose or work with the team to choose how they're going to work. What kind of, like, are they going to work Kanban, Scrum, some variation, whatever. And I knew, oh God, here we go again, right? I got this real tough customer in the team, and he's going to make this difficult. But this time around, I sat down with him and I shared with him the agenda for the offsite. I said, here's what I'm thinking and why. So I think we will work. I tried to give as many kind of research-backed answers, because he was very intelligent around certain activities I wanted to do with the team. And I even came up with multiple workshops that we could do to solve the one problem. So it's like, if you've got a preference, you could choose A over B or B over A, right?
What was the problem?
What do you mean?
You mean you came up with multiple workshops to solve the one
Oh,
problem?
right. I mean, the problem is basically having a team of people aligned on what problem they're here to solve, how they're going to solve it, how they're going to work together.
Right.
So basically, like, kicking off a team where they can be productive, basically.
Okay.
And that, firstly, the PO and I communicated to the team that we felt that was a good thing to do, and he was on board with it. So that wasn't the issue. But one of his criticisms was that, Agile coaches just put stuff in the calendar, and all of a sudden you're in a room doing some workshop that you fundamentally don't even agree with. And to him, that was very frustrating. And hey, I can't argue with that. Like, that's a fairly legitimate reason to be frustrated if that's something that you care about. And so I really took the time to go through the agenda for this kickoff. It was like a full day offsite and different workshops. And I ran him through it. I said, For example, what was the one that I think he didn't mind about most of the workshops, but there was one in particular. That's right. It was like, I want each person in the team to have an understanding of what makes the other person tick, and like try to get to know each other a little better so that we're able to feel like we can have healthy conflicts in the team, because that enables us to move fast. And also having an understanding of what backgrounds each person brings to the team, what skills, what competencies, experiences, and so on. And so the two workshop ideas I had for this, one was journey lines. Have you ever heard of that exercise?
I have, but
actually, I'll just
I'd love to.
Yeah,
for the audience, definitely.
Yeah, for the audience. So journey lines that I got from Lisa Atkins as well. Basically, you draw on a graph the highs and lows of either your life or your career, depending on how deep you want to go with this. And the point of the exercise is not only to get an understanding of like some of the experiences people have had, but it helps people to share vulnerability, which creates trust. And so if you've ever read 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, really, really recommend it. The first major dysfunction in a team is an absence of trust. So being vulnerable enables you to feel like you can trust someone. So that was one option, and he was not a fan of that option. The other option was called market of skills, I think, where you basically draw up on a big piece of paper what skills you have, what you're willing to learn, what you want to learn, and some other factors, maybe where you've worked, so on and so on. The vulnerability aspect of that is a bit lower by saying, here are some skills I don't have, but I would like to learn, but it's still there. And he was like, I would much prefer to do that one than the other one. And I acknowledged that. I honored that. And so we went ahead with the offsite. I facilitated the hell out of it. Like everything ran really to time, which he also appreciated. And at the end of the workshop, the next day I get an email from him, and it said feedback. And I thought, oh no, here we go.
One of those.
Uh-oh.
I've had a couple of those emails.
But it was extremely positive. And it, no joke, I could not believe my eyes. And this is like, out of all the things I've done at Spotify, being responsible for being product manager for the second biggest platform at the company with a third of the company's monthly active users, all the big things that I feel pretty proud about. This is by far my proudest moment. In this email, he said, "You have restored my faith in Agile coaches."
Wow. That's a
and
high praise.
I just couldn't believe it. I was just like, wow. And the only reason that happened is because I took the time to understand where he is coming from. And that's it. Coming into that conversation with an open mind, not with an agenda, not with something I'm trying to push, but just to seek to understand. There's lots of catchphrases, meet people where they are. And I would say part of the inspiration for this is Lisa Atkins as well, taking her Coaching Agile Teams course that I got to do in Stockholm, reading her book. She is a huge inspiration for me, because a lot of it is about self-management. As a coach, thinking about how to be a coach, how to leave your ego and your agenda at the door and coming in and just trying to understand people so that you can help them find the path to what they're looking for. And hopefully that aligns with what the business is trying to achieve. And if it doesn't, you can at least be a mirror to that. And that in itself is helpful. So yeah, I mean, that learning, that experience flows through into everything I do, I think. And of course, I'm not always like, I still make lots of mistakes, but yeah.
Very nice answer. In typical fashion, we've gone over time from our scheduled time again, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, every minute of the overtime. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation and going down some of those specific branches of this wonderful tree of wisdom that you bring. Thanks so much for your time, Brendan. Just before we actually close, I really want to ask, is there anything that you would like to share, talk about, ask me, even if it's something that you're working on that you would like to share, anything about Organa at the moment, anything you'd like to say at all?
Sure. It's kind of like the shout out part of this. I suppose I would just say that I absolutely love working at Organa. It's quite difficult to explain to people what it is, but it's basically a model where between the four of us, we're each consultants, we could each be out there working individually as contractors or consultants, but we choose to do it together because we value a community. We value having a community. And we're all, none of us really come from consulting backgrounds. So we come from experience out in the industry. We think that that's an advantage over companies where most of the people have been working as consultants their whole life, because we're accustomed to being in it, the real world examples. So, if that sounds interesting to you in the kind of agile product org design kind of space, hit us up, chat to us. We're very approachable. We're very honest, transparent about pretty much everything. And the other thing I would mention is I always like the opportunity to shout out the nonprofit that I worked for, 29K. They have an amazing app which combines proven psychology-based interventions with online, what is effectively group therapy, but without a therapist. So we built an app that facilitates the process of group therapy, of group sharing around a particular topic that you've learnt about, something about, or introspected on something, in a way that's really held. It's the best way I can describe it. It's completely and utterly free. It's funded by philanthropists. There is no ulterior motive other than to try and help get people the mental support out there. There's never been a more important time for stuff like this. Costs nothing, which actually makes it a hard product to sell, because sometimes people prefer to pay for something than to get it for free, which is interesting. But yeah, they have courses on finding your values, self-compassion, managing yourself in a time of crisis, which is quite helpful in these COVID times. They probably got a bunch more courses that I haven't seen yet that are already there, but I highly recommend trying it out if you want to learn more about yourself, tackle issues like stress, self-compassion, all that sort of stuff. So you can find them on the App Store and Android store under 29K, just because I'm still a big fan of theirs from the sidelines and try to cheer them on, because I think what they're doing is really awesome.
And I can attest to that. I've had to play with the app and it's really nice. It's very, very helpful. I probably haven't encouraged enough people who need it to do it. So thanks for the reminder. I'll get more people to check it out as well. And of course, in the show notes, we'll put a link. If people want to reach you, or if people want to learn more about Organa, where can they go?
Yeah, they can go to organa.com.au. I have a blog where I blog about some of the topics we've talked about, which is just my name, brendanmarsh.com, or organa.com.au, which is if you want to work with us. It's probably the best. Or you can add me on LinkedIn, I suppose. I usually accept most requests I get, unless they're offshore development companies trying to sell me offshore engineers. That's quite a common one.
It is indeed.
Unless you're that, feel free to add me.
Okay. No, people trying to reach out and help us sell more coaching, please. I've got enough of those unaccepted invites sitting in my requests as well. Oh boy. Brendan, it's been a blast, man.
Yeah. I was about to
Thanks
say
so
the
much.
same thing, Dev. Thanks a lot.
I'm glad you had fun. Yeah, seriously, I'm really looking forward to doing this again. And yeah, let's explore that idea of having some specific thematic conversations.
Sure. Sounds
Okay,
good.
buddy.
Thanks a lot for having me, Dev.
Thanks for being here.
And all the kind words. I'm going to have to get some humbling after this because you've made my head very big from this conversation.
Thanks for making it to the end of this episode. You'll be able to find the show notes and more at my website over at leadbydesign.show. I really hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, then I have a request for you. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're watching or listening to it, and share this episode with someone directly who you believe would benefit from this conversation. Thanks for listening.